In August 2002, a calm Sunday afternoon in Dallas, Texas, turned into a scene of pure horror inside a quiet suburban home. The Ochoa family had just returned from church, relaxed, unwinding, unaware that within minutes, their house would become a slaughterhouse. What happened next would shock even the most seasoned detectives. Without warning, 29-year-old Cecilia Ochoa and 4 of her loved ones were gunned down in cold blood, shot multiple times by the very man they trusted most. Her husband, Abel Revill Ochoa, pulled the trigger again and again, leaving behind 2 lifeless daughters, his father-in-law and his sister-in-law, before calmly walking out the door. But this wasn't a crime of rage. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't revenge. It was crack cocaine, a monster that had gripped Abel's mind and body so tightly that when the craving hit, nothing, not even his family, stood in its way. In the hours that followed, Abel drove off, tried using his wife's ATM card to buy more drugs, and then confessed, claiming he barely remembered what he'd done. He said it was the addiction. Others called it pure evil. To understand how a man's spiral into crack addiction led to one of Dallas's most chilling family massacres, and what he said moments before the lethal injection, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon, because this is the kind of story that shows how one bad choice can turn a man into a monster, and a home into a crime scene no one will ever forget. He was born on January 23, 1973, in Durango, Mexico, a small, rugged town where family and faith meant everything. Growing up, Abel Revill Ochoa wasn't the kind of boy anyone would predict would one day make national headlines for mass murder. He was quiet, reserved, and hard-working, traits that earned him the respect of those around him. When he moved to the United States, he worked long hours as a heavy equipment operator, building a simple but stable life in Dallas, Texas. There, he met Cecilia, a kind-hearted woman who became his anchor. Together they built what looked like the perfect little family: 2 daughters, Crystal, a bright 7-year-old with a smile that could light up a room, and baby Anae, just 9 months old, innocent and adored by everyone who met her. Their home wasn't luxurious, but it was filled with laughter, faith, and the kind of love that neighbors admired from afar. To anyone on the outside, the Ochoas were the image of normalcy, a hard-working couple chasing the American dream. They attended church on Sundays, cooked together, took family photos, and spent evenings watching TV like any other family. But beneath that calm, picture-perfect surface, something dark was festering. At the turn of the new millennium, the Ochoa household still looked peaceful from the outside: family dinners, Sunday services, and quiet evenings after long workdays. But behind closed doors, Abel Revill Ochoa was fighting a battle no one could see, and one he was losing fast. It started innocently enough, or so he thought. Around the year 2000, a friend offered him something that promised quick relief from stress and exhaustion: crack cocaine. For a man who'd been working long hours and carrying the financial weight of his growing family, that first high felt like freedom. It was calm in a pipe and escape in smoke. But as anyone who's faced addiction knows, the escape never lasts. And once it ends, the craving comes back twice as strong. At first it was just 1 hit after work. Then 1 became 2. 2 became daily. Soon, Abel was spending nearly $300 a week. Money meant for rent, groceries, and his children, just to feed a hunger that no longer felt like a choice. He'd borrow from friends, take small loans, and even pawn off possessions. The addiction began to reshape his life in silence. His eyes grew hollow. His temper shortened. His paychecks vanished faster than he could earn them. Cecilia noticed the change first: the long nights out, the missing money, the way his smile stopped reaching his eyes. She begged him to stop, cried for him to get help. His family prayed, tried interventions, even suggested church-based rehabilitation. And for a while it seemed to work. There was a short stretch when Abel appeared to turn a corner. He quit cold turkey, desperate to win back his family's trust. For 10 days he stayed clean. 10 long, painful, restless days where his body shook, his skin crawled, and his mind screamed for another hit. He prayed through the nights, pacing the floor, reading the Bible, trying to fill the void that the drug had carved inside him. But crack doesn't let go easily. And when the cravings returned, they came back with vengeance. He slipped again, one night became a week, and before long, Abel was right back where he started, trapped in the cycle of smoke, guilt, and self-destruction. Each time he hit the pipe, the man he used to be disappeared a little more. His co-workers started to notice his decline. The quiet, dependable man they once respected now showed up late, unfocused, jittery. He'd disappear for hours, lost in a haze. At home, tension boiled. Arguments replaced laughter. His wife's patience thinned. The home once filled with warmth was now filled with fear. Cecilia tried to save him, but addiction had already built a wall between them, one no love could break through. They say crack cocaine is a demon that whispers promises of peace, only to steal your soul. For Abel, that demon never stopped whispering. Every time he thought he was free, it pulled him right back, reminding him that the fight was never over. By this point, Abel's world was spiraling out of control. The drugs had taken his money, his peace, and the trust of the people who loved him most. And soon they would take something far more devastating. As you watch this, think about this. At what point do we stop blaming addiction and start holding the addict accountable for their choices? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because in the next part of this story, that question becomes chillingly real. It was Sunday, August 4th, 2002, a warm, golden morning in Dallas, Texas. The kind of morning that should have been peaceful, ordinary, filled with the quiet rhythm of family life. The Ochoas, Abel, his wife Cecilia, their daughters Crystal and baby Anaí, along with Cecilia's father and sister, began their day like many others, attending church together. But those who sat near them noticed something unsettling about Abel that morning. He was sweating profusely despite the air-conditioned sanctuary, his leg bouncing anxiously under the pew, eyes darting as if searching for something only he could see. His wife leaned close, whispering softly, but Abel barely heard her. His mind was somewhere else, trapped in a whirlpool of unease. After the service, they drove home to their modest Dallas house. The family gathered around the table for lunch, the smell of home-cooked food filling the air. Yet beneath that domestic calm, tension pulsed like a silent alarm. Abel's hands trembled slightly as he ate. His mind screamed for relief, for a way to silence the torment clawing at him from the inside. He turned to Cecilia, voice low and shaky, asking if she could spare $10. She looked at him, weary and heartbroken, knowing exactly what he wanted it for. She refused. It wasn't anger in her eyes, it was fear and sorrow. Abel stood up, pacing. The rejection sent his thoughts spiraling. He went into the bedroom, shut the door, and took one last hit from what little he had left. The rush was fleeting. Within minutes, the high evaporated, leaving behind an empty, gnawing desperation that twisted into rage. His pulse thundered, his breathing quickened, and something inside him snapped. He walked to the closet and opened a drawer. Inside was his 9mm pistol. Cold metal, silent, waiting. Without hesitation he loaded it, his hand steady now, eerily calm. As he stepped back into the living room, the hum of the ceiling fan and the chatter of his family filled the air, the last moments of peace they would ever know. Then came the sound that shattered everything. Boom. A single gunshot echoed through the house, followed by screams, chaos, and confusion. The sound of the first gunshot shattered the quiet of that Sunday afternoon, a sound that would echo through the Ochoa home and through Dallas for years to come. Panic erupted instantly. Family members screamed, scrambled for safety, confusion mixing with disbelief. In that small, modest home, the walls that once held laughter now trapped terror. Cecilia Ochoa, Abel's wife, just 29 years old, was the first to fall. She barely had time to react, to plead, to move. Her death was instant. Their daughter Crystal, only 7, screamed for her mother, her small voice piercing through the chaos. Abel turned toward her, his own daughter, and in a moment that defies understanding, raised the gun again. Crystal tried to run, her little feet pounding against the floor, but he followed her, his eyes cold and detached. Seconds later, silence. 9-month-old Anaí lay in her crib, unaware of the horror around her. She never had the chance to crawl, to speak, to live. Nearby, Cecilia's father, Bartolo Alviso, rushed forward, perhaps to stop Abel, perhaps simply to shield his family, but Abel turned on him too, pulling the trigger without hesitation. Jacqueline Sala, Cecilia's sister, tried to flee toward the kitchen, but she didn't make it far. Within moments, the home that once held 6 loving family members was filled with smoke, blood, and death. And yet, one person somehow survived. Alma Alviso, Cecilia's sister, was struck but not killed. Bleeding and disoriented, she played dead, holding her breath as footsteps moved around her. Through her blurred vision, she saw Abel methodically reloading his pistol. Calm, deliberate, almost mechanical. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't panicking. He was finishing. When it was over, Abel walked outside. No tears, no rage, but just eerie composure. He climbed into his wife's car, started the engine, and drove away as if nothing had happened. Behind him, the home was silent. 5 lives gone, one barely clinging to hers. Hours later, when police arrived, the scene they found inside was almost too horrific to describe. 5 bodies, 1 home, and a single survivor. And no sign of Abel Ochoa. Even seasoned officers, Men and women hardened by years on the job were shaken. One later said it was like walking into a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. A massacre born not of revenge, not of greed, but of something darker, more senseless. As the investigation began, one haunting question hung in the air. How could a father, a husband, a man who once sat in church that very morning, become capable of such unimaginable violence? Let me know in the comments. Do you think evil can live quietly inside someone, waiting for the moment to strike? After the massacre, the streets of Dallas fell eerily still, but the man responsible was already on the move. Abel Ochoa, wearing the same clothes soaked in sweat and residue from the horror he had unleashed, climbed into his wife's car and drove aimlessly through the city. 4 hours he drifted through traffic, eyes hollow, mind detached from reality. But what he did next revealed a chilling level of detachment. Instead of running far or hiding deep, Abel stopped at an ATM, trying to use his wife's debit card to withdraw cash. The same wife he had just murdered. When the transaction failed, he tried again. The camera above the ATM caught it all. His blank expression, his stillness, his eerie calm. By now, police had already received multiple 911 calls from horrified neighbors who heard the gunshots. Within minutes, a statewide manhunt began. Officers tracked the ATM activity and quickly traced the vehicle, Cecilia's car, to a nearby shopping center. When they arrived, Abel was sitting inside, staring out the windshield as if waiting for something inevitable. There was no chase, no gunfire, no struggle. When officers approached with weapons drawn, Abel slowly raised his hands and surrendered without a word. The calmness in his surrender stunned everyone. It was as if the storm inside him had suddenly gone quiet. At the Dallas Police Department, detectives sat across from Abel in the interrogation room. He didn't fight, didn't deny, didn't even ask for a lawyer. He confessed almost immediately. But what he said left investigators uneasy. Abel claimed he didn't remember pulling the trigger, didn't remember the screams, the blood, the bodies. His words were hauntingly simple. It's like something took over me. He said he'd been battling unbearable withdrawal, which his body and mind were in chaos, that the craving had twisted him into someone he didn't recognize. Officers wrote down every word, trying to understand how a man who once knelt in prayer with his family could become the executioner of his own blood. The confession was on record, calm, coherent, and chillingly detached. Abel Ochoa showed no tears, no rage, no remorse, just exhaustion, as if the weight of his actions hadn't yet settled in. As news of the arrest spread, the Dallas community reeled. Reporters surrounded the station, neighbors gathered in disbelief, and the question echoed through every headline: how does a man go from worship to slaughter in the span of a single day? When the trial of Abel Revill Ochoa began, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, family members, and ordinary citizens drawn by the haunting brutality of the case. The air inside was heavy, thick with tension and disbelief. Here sat a man who had once been a husband, a father, a churchgoer, and now he faced 5 counts of capital murder. The stakes were clear from the start. If convicted, he would pay the ultimate price. The prosecution wasted no time painting Ochoa as a cold-blooded family annihilator. They detailed the horror that unfolded that August afternoon, walking the jury through each life taken in that small Dallas home. Photos were shown, carefully, painfully, of the victims. The jurors sat stone-faced, but some couldn't hold back tears. The prosecutor's voice broke only once, when describing little Crystal's final moments, her attempt to run, and how her father chased her down. This, the prosecutor said, was not a moment of madness. This was a choice. But the defense told a different story, one not of evil but of a man consumed by addiction and mental collapse. They argued that Abel was suffering from crack-induced psychosis, worsened by years of substance abuse and possible brain damage. His defense attorney spoke softly but passionately, describing Abel as a man broken by trauma and chemical dependence, someone who had lost control of his mind and body. They even brought in psychologists to testify that his withdrawal symptoms could have triggered a violent, uncontrollable outburst. Then came one of the most emotional moments of the trial, when Alma Alviso, the sole surviving victim, took the stand. She recounted in vivid detail the screams, the gunfire, the smell of gunpowder, and the silence that followed. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she never looked away from Abel. "I'll never forget what he did," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But I still pray for him." The room went completely silent. Even the judge seemed moved. 4 days, both sides battled. Science against morality, addiction against accountability. The jurors listened to every word, weighed every image. And when the time came, they filed out to deliberate. Hours later, they returned, faces pale but resolute. The foreman stood, the verdict form in hand. We, the jury, find the defendant, Abel Revill Ochoa, guilty of capital murder. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Cecilia's family members sobbed quietly in the back row. Abel sat motionless, eyes fixed on the floor, expression unreadable. Moments later, the judge delivered the sentence that sealed his fate: death by lethal injection. And just like that, the story of a once loving father ended where justice and tragedy met. A death sentence for a man who had destroyed his own bloodline. For the next 17 years, Abel Ochoa's world shrank to a 6x9 concrete cell on Texas death row. The days were long, silent, and unchanging. Inmates around him were executed one by one as the years passed, each departure marked only by a name scratched off a list. Within those gray walls, Abel seemed to undergo a transformation. He reportedly found religion, began reading the Bible daily, and often prayed aloud for forgiveness. Guards described him as polite, quiet, and calm, a stark contrast to the man who once unleashed unimaginable horror on his family. Letters from those who knew him told a complicated story. Some relatives said they had found it in their hearts to forgive him, believing that the man who committed those murders was no longer the same person sitting on death row. Others, however, could never let go. "He took everything from us," one family member said during a prison interview. "No amount of prayer can change that." Abel filed numerous appeals, all centered around claims of mental instability, trauma, and the long-term effects of addiction. But one by one, those appeals were denied. The courts ruled that he had understood his actions, and that his remorse, though sincere, could not undo the crime. Mental health experts debated his sanity to the very end, some arguing he was fully aware of his choices, others insisting he was trapped in a delusional state of withdrawal and despair. When reporters interviewed him near the end of his life, Abel's words were quiet, almost broken. "I am sorry for what I've done," he said. "I wish I could take it back." He spent his remaining years writing letters, reading scripture, and awaiting the day his name would be called. Locked in that small concrete room, he said his mind was finally clear, but the silence was unbearable. No voices, no laughter, no cries from his daughters. Just the sound of his own regret echoing against the walls. After nearly 2 decades on death row, the day Abel Revill Ochoa had long awaited, and long feared, finally arrived. February 6, 2020, dawned gray and cold over Huntsville, Texas. Inside the Walls unit, the state's execution chamber stood silent, its green-tiled walls and single observation window waiting for the next name on the list. That name was Abel Ochoa. Guards moved quietly through the cell block that morning. There was no drama, no resistance. Abel had grown accustomed to the slow rhythm of death row, and now, as he packed his few belongings, a worn Bible, a rosary, a handful of letters, he seemed at peace. Inmates around him called out faint goodbyes as he walked past, shackled at the wrists and ankles. He nodded to them, whispering a simple, "God bless you." As for his final meal, Abel was served the standard meal tray offered by the prison kitchen. Simple, unremarkable food that he barely touched. It was as if the hunger had left him long ago. He spent most of the afternoon with the prison chaplain, reading from the book of Psalms, praying, and quietly reflecting on the life he'd destroyed and the forgiveness he hoped to find beyond the walls of the Huntsville unit. As the clock struck 6 p.m., witnesses were escorted into the small viewing chamber. On one side of the glass sat members of the media and the victim's family, Cecilia's relatives, the people whose lives had been shattered nearly 18 years earlier. Some held hands, others wiped away tears. On the other side, Abel was led into the execution room, dressed in white, calm and composed. He was gently strapped onto the gurney, IV lines inserted into his arms. Above him, bright fluorescent lights hummed softly. When the warden asked if he had any final words, Abel took a deep breath and spoke in a low, trembling voice that carried across the room. "I would like to thank God, my dad, my Lord Jesus Savior for saving me and changing my life," he began. "I want to apologize to my in-laws for causing all this emotional pain. I love y'all and consider y'all my sisters I never had. I want to thank you for forgiving me." His voice broke slightly as he finished. Then he closed his eyes and began whispering a prayer. Moments later, the warden signaled for the lethal injection to begin. A clear liquid began to flow through the tubes, entering his veins. Abel continued to mouth silent prayers, his lips barely moving. Within minutes, his breathing slowed, his body grew still. At 6:48 p.m., he was pronounced dead, 23 minutes after the drugs were administered. Witnesses described his final moments as peaceful, even serene. No struggle. No pain. Just a quiet surrender to the inevitable. For some of Cecilia's family, it was the closure they had waited nearly 2 decades for. For others, it was a hollow end to a tragedy that no execution could ever truly erase. As his body was wheeled away, the chamber returned to silence. The story of Abel Ochoa, the husband, the father, the killer, had reached its final chapter. And that's how it ended: a family gone, a father executed, and a legacy stained by grief. Abel Revill Ochoa's story isn't just about murder. It's a haunting reminder of how darkness can take root in anyone who lets despair win. Now it's your turn. Share your thoughts below. Do you believe Abel truly found redemption before his final breath? If you found this story powerful, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because every week, we uncover real cases that reveal how thin the line truly is between sanity and tragedy.